Hey everybody, Ranger Andrew here for Martin Van Buren National Historic Site, and it's April, which means that it's National Poetry Month. And poetry is a pretty big deal during Van Buren's lifetime, but I'm not exactly an expert in that field. So I decided to bring in an expert in that field so we could talk a little bit about it. So I'd like to introduce you guys to Columbia Green English Professor, Ghent Town Historian, and General Columbia County Public Intellectual, Gregg Berninger.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a particular privilege to be here to talk about this topic. As a professor of English, I'm very interested in this topic from a scholarly angle for poetry in this time period's place in the evolution of American poetry as an art form. And as the town historian of Ghent, I'm very interested in the topic because poetry was a very popular medium at the time. It would have had a place in almost every American home and in many public spaces as well.
Gregg, you've already referred to this a little bit, but what was poetry like broad strokes as a medium during Van Buren's lifetime?
Well, poetry in at least the second half of Van Buren's lifetime really came into its own in America. And it's really probably most embodied in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was wildly popular. There was one year, Andrew, in the 1860s when Longfellow made $48,000. Most poets today only dream of making $48,000 a year, and that's in the year 2020. He became a national icon, and long after he was dead, children in schools all over America celebrated his birthday. And Longfellow really wrote what we think of as a maybe dictionary definition of a poem. Clever, not too hard to understand, rhymes, thought-provoking, brings a sense of peace and understanding, plucks at the heartstrings, but also gives the mind something to think about. He did take on some what we might consider political issues, writing about freeing of slaves, taking a little risk there whenever you take a political position. Also, maybe even equally popular was Lydia Huntley Sigourney, and she was a New England poet. She brought a lot of attention to the sort of memories of the bad things white people did to Indians. And she was so popular that one women's magazine paid her $500 a year just for her name to appear on the title page. So she also made a pretty good living at being a poet. And of course, maybe the one many people think about today, at least English professors, Walt Whitman revolutionized the genre, and he invented what is truly an American form of poetry. Big, sexual, free, wide-ranging. And on the other extreme, during the latter part of Van Buren's life, we have Emily Dickinson in her bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts, writing some of the best poetry ever written in the English language, and then organizing them and putting them in her desk for a later generation to discover. People in Van Buren's lifetime loved poetry. And it was much more than the big names that I already mentioned. People read it at home around the fireplace, they read it alone, they copied poems into journals, they read them at public elocutions, they heard them at minstrel shows. It was a very, very popular art form, and probably from 1835 to maybe 1875, the most popular of all literary forms at the time in America. Even the illiterate, which were few, could hear it. Could hear their family reading it at the fireplace. And as far as all classes, like I said, absolutely. Anybody who could read could find a poem, probably far easier in what we think of as a traditional print poem, much easier than any of us could find today outside of the internet.
Gregg, do you think it's fair to say that Van Buren would have enjoyed poetry growing up in the tavern as a kid, but then also would have enjoyed it living in the White House? A good comparison?
Yes, and maybe the poems that he heard in the tavern may be less family-friendly than we would like to think of today, as far as children's poems go.
Gregg, is there a connection between poetry and politics during Van Buren's lifetime?
Without question. And much of it was around the issue of slavery. Michael C. Cohen, in his book, The Social Lives of Poems in 19th Century America, he writes a lot about how poems were used in the 19th century, not so much studied or read, but the purposes they were used for, again, including advertising and popular entertainment. And Cohen writes in his book, "The work of abolition was born on the wings of poetry. To put the point as strongly as possible, poems made reform possible as a social project. And he points to thousands of activists who wrote songs, hymns, laments, satires, ballads, and odes in the service of anti-slavery, to change hearts and minds, to recruit new members, and to build solidarity within local organizations and across the transnational movement. Wow. And of course, poetry was also used against Van Buren, we could say, in the campaign of 1840 with the song Van Van, the Used Up Man, which there are several verses of and even recordings you can find. And back to Walt Whitman, another New York Stater. He was very interested in Van Buren. They both had Dutch ancestry. Whitman was a delegate at the 1848 Free Soil Convention in Buffalo that nominated Van Buren for his final run for the presidency. And, Whitman was very interested in government and very interested in how government related to the individual. And he wrote a lot about how it's very American to be an individual, but to be a part of a group of individuals. So I love that phrase, group of individuals, and that's really what America is.
So what poem did you pick out for us to read today?
I picked out an early Walt Whitman, really a fragment that became a part of his always being revised and epic Leaves of Grass. I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the masters and the slaves, entering into both so that both shall understand me alike. You see that as classic Whitman. You see him trying to embody every American, the enslaver, the enslaved. No poet or person has ever put more effort into encompassing all of America and all of its contradictions and multitudes, as he put it, and the entire person, the soul as well as the body.
So a lot of poetry covers the issues of Van Buren's lifetime, but is Van Buren himself ever the subject of any poems?
Well, as we've come to expect over the years, Van Buren's always popping up in the strangest of places. He comes up on Jeopardy every so often. Of course, he had a brief fame in Doonesbury cartoons in the early 90s when the first George Bush was running for president. And of course, he shows up in poems as a cameo or maybe more. And in looking into this, I found a nice poem from 2013 by Jaswinder Bolina called Mine is the First Rodeo, Mine is the Last Accolade. And I'll just read the first part for you.
Sure.
I'm grateful to the man now sleeping with my ex-lover. It's true I loved her, but it's right that someone be with her now in the dark hour of our republic. Life is no good anymore. There are no jobs and no money. So it's good that someone be with her now under street lamps filtered through sheer curtains at night. The pale approximation of daylight illuminating the outer slope of my ex-lover's left thigh, and the asymmetric birthmark located there, I thought resembled the bust of Martin Van Buren, which that man should smooch now and cherish as I did those tender hours on the other side of time and the Republic. And he goes on from there. So always curious about choices poets make, and Martin Van Buren. I did a little research and I found an interview with Mr. Bolina, and he was asked about Van Buren here, and he wrote, he said, the poem began with the idea of a birthmark in the shape of Martin Van Buren. This image somehow led to a meditation on aftermath, both personal and national, and a speaker who deals with his feelings of nostalgia and resignation with a measure of wryness. And I reached out to Mr. Bolina a couple weeks ago to sort of ask him the same question he answered there, and he gave a similar answer. He remembered wanting to name someone recognizable, but not a Washington or a Jefferson, someone more like Van Buren. And then the image of Van Buren, he said, his gloriously wild hair, which seemed perfect for a birthmark.
We have an entire month dedicated to poetry. It's National Poetry Month. And we've talked about poetry all the way from Van Buren's time up through to modern times. Why do you think poetry is important?
There are two ways to think of poetry, and I think Poetry Month conceives of it as poetry on the page, a book of poetry, something a poet writes and we look at. So we'll talk about that first. And I think it is important to keep that in people's hearts and minds. I think it works our mind in a different way. It uses language differently. Unfortunately, it became a bit more obscure, dare I say even obtuse, in the 1920s and with modern poets. But you can easily find poets like Mr. Bolina where you can read it and get something out of it. It's important to remember that it's especially important now to think about reading a poem and just musing on it, right? I don't have to understand it right away. Maybe I won't even understand it. Maybe that's not the goal. Maybe it's just to evoke something in me and then to revisit it. So it's an underappreciated art form in that printed manner. Now, if you broaden your definition of poetry as maybe a more 19th century definition, that it's any written word, spoken word that is not in sentences and paragraphs, then you can make a case it's never been more popular. A lot of hip-hop music, maybe non-melodic, is poetry with rhythm and rhyme and meter. And even melodic music is a form of poetry. Now, would we say that Taylor Swift's Shake It Off, haters gonna hate, 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 is poetic? Well, is it enjoyable? Does it make you think? Sure, we'll call that a poem. 2016, a bit of a shocker, but nobody was terribly upset about it. The Nobel Prize winner, the biggest award for literature on earth, went to an American, Bob Dylan, because his music, in most people's minds, qualifies as poetry. And when I heard that, I thought, yeah, I like that. And I wondered what the literary community would say. And I didn't see a lot of outrage. I think people, once it settled on folks, they thought, yeah, that's deserving. So I like Poetry Month because it does bring attention to poets and maybe even gives them a little work doing readings. But I think we do need to keep in mind poetry as a form is much broader than just on a page.
So in a way, we're surrounded by it.
We are. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down to talk to us today, Greg. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody at home for watching as well. If you're interested in reading the full version of either poem we shared in this video, either Jaswinder Bolina's or Walt Whitman's, we will put links to the full versions of both of those in the description of this video, so feel free to check those out. And if you're interested in celebrating National Poetry Month a little bit further, of course, feel free to research and read some poems on your own, but if you want to learn a little bit more about some of America's biggest name poets, the National Park Service actually maintains sites dedicated to a few of them. Some from Van Buren's lifetime, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose house is over in Boston, or Edgar Allan Poe, whose home is in Philadelphia, but also some well beyond Van Buren's lifetime, like Carl Sandburg, whose home is in North Carolina. So feel free to check out their websites and see when they're giving tours to check them out and learn a little bit more about them. But however you decide to celebrate National Poetry Month, thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time.